Okay, so what we'd like to do tonight is to consider Jerusalem in the Bible from a perspective of what is it about, why is it in the Bible, how does it fit into the theme, as a theme in the Bible. Now,
computer tech to upstairs computer room, please. Computer tech to upstairs computer room.
No, I'm waiting for the Candyland announcement again. I'm out of here if I get the Candyland announcement. Even a casual, somebody doesn't even know anything about the Bible at all, knows something is important about Jerusalem. It plays a very important role somewhere. Now, anyone who studies the Bible in a little bit of detail realizes that is indeed the case. It is very important to the storyline. Now, one thing that is important to realize about the Bible, because whenever you have an important storyline, the way to approach it is to take a look at how it's developed. Where does the story start? How is it expanded? And then sort of what's the climax of the story. So it is a topic like Jerusalem is more than just, hey, this is a location and just happens to be in a convenient location and it kind of just fits in because it's at the right place at the right time. That's highly unlikely and something that that it occurs as such an important place in the scriptural text. By the way, just to let you know that the Bible is very consistent in presenting themes. I like to think of the Bible can be thought of as many ways. It's a novel. It's very much a story that has a beginning, a middle, and the end. Another way to think about it is it's the prototypical PowerPoint presentation. If anyone ever learned how to do a PowerPoint presentation, the way you do a PowerPoint presentation is you tell them what you want to tell them, then you go ahead and tell them, and then you tell them what you told them. And the Bible is very much constructed in that fashion. So all the critical themes are introduced quite quickly and in a very concise way at the beginning of the Bible, and then those themes are expanded throughout the scriptural text. And then at the conclusion of the Bible, it's really a review and a completion of all these different themes. So if that were to be the case, where would we see Jerusalem at the beginning of the story as introduced in some fashion? Now, there's what about the two great commandments of God? Love the Lord thy God with all thy heart, soul, and might, and love thy neighbor as thyself. Well, that's easy that's introduced by the breakdown of those two laws, right? Adam, the first sin, Adam and Eve don't do what God says, which is a contradiction to the first command, and the second sin we're told about, Cain and Abel murder, one brother murders another. We're given, laid out in a very concise fashion, the epic battle between good and evil, and that would play a very important role. It's summarized in a single verse, introduced in a single verse, Genesis 3:15. The concept of meekness and pride, and the fundamental contradiction between those two ways of thinking. Genesis 4:15, Enoch and Lamech. Layout of all the pursuits of mankind, Genesis chapter 10, all the interests under the sun that man would occupy himself with are laid out in a very concise fashion, and then we see how that is really countered against a thought process and a mindset of spiritual thinking throughout the Bible. We even have, of course, you only have to get to Genesis chapter 12, and you have all the key promises to Abraham laid out there. Very important to introduce at the beginning. So you think, where is Jerusalem? Important theme, it has to be there somewhere. And sure enough, it is. Though what's interesting about the way Jerusalem is introduced is it's done quite deliberately, very concisely, almost as in a cameo role to start off, because the Jerusalem theme is not meant to be expanded in a comprehensive way until later. And we'll see why. There's a reason for that. Part of the theme is the time at which it becomes center stage in the Bible. And that's not meant to be at the very beginning, but it is introduced in a brief way and in a way which is quite compelling. So without getting into a lot of the details of the story of Abram and saving Lot, his nephew, interaction with the kings of Sodom and Gomorrah and some others, we have this character who comes out of nowhere and disappears into nowhere, Melchizedek, king of Salem. Melchizedek means king of righteousness. Now we know Salem is indeed Jerusalem due to some cross-references in Psalm 76 verse 2. Jerusalem is referred to as being Salem. There are some obvious pieces of the context which are quite informative. I mean, Abraham was literally right in the vicinity of where we know Jerusalem to be, etc. But the way this is introduced into the storyline, without expanding, there's a lot of questions in the end that are not answered when Melchizedek and his city Salem are introduced. But this is a very important location. It's a place which has a king who's a righteous king, someone who even the patriarch Abraham looks up to. There's some interesting tidbits of the story, but we're not given any more than that. We're just introduced in the time of Abraham, have that connection, and then the storyline moves on, and the primary focus is the patriarchs, which is the theme that gets built throughout the remainder of Genesis. Now, so really we end with the initial introduction of Salem as, keep this place in mind, it's important, but we're going to come back to it. Now, the next time that we see Jerusalem is another fitting time, brief role, but an important role, and a one that carries on this theme that was introduced back in Genesis 14. And that is many years later in the book of Joshua. Now, by the way, Joshua is the Hebrew form of Jesus, which is the Greek form of that name. So, you don't have to dig very deeply into the book of Joshua to see types and comparisons to Jesus and the role, the defining role of Jesus, and we see it in a lesser degree with this character Joshua. And Joshua brings the people into the promised land from their wanderings in the wilderness after they left Egypt. And the next time we see Jerusalem, it has another king, Adonai-Zedek, which has a nice sounding name, Lord of Righteousness. You think, well, okay, so we're carrying this theme of king, priest, of religious leader. But at this point, it's obvious that this is an apostate individual. Joshua comes into the land, and this city and this king is the center point of the rally against Joshua and against the Israelites. So a great battle ensues, and then this king is defeated by Joshua's army. Now, what's interesting though is it really again is just reminding us of the importance of the Jerusalem idea. And now we have an apostate situation. It's introduced as with this righteous king, gets reintroduced again now as an evil individual who leads a resistance against Joshua, a figure of Christ, figure of Jesus. But that's really it. It kind of recedes back into the background because, again, the purpose of the theme of Jerusalem is not really meant to be center stage at this point. We're just introduced once again to it. But we see from a little bit later in the book of Joshua that actually Jerusalem remains in Gentile hands for many centuries. And that brings us to the next occurrence. And the next occurrence really is, again, as brief as it is in Judges 19. So Judges is a period of a long period of time, centuries of time after the death of Joshua, a time of chaos in the land. If anyone is interested in Near East history, this was a time of precipitous decline of the Hittite Empire. The Egyptian force is not strong in this area. It's quite chaotic. The Israelites are very much left to defend for themselves, very divided. And the theme of Judges is, and it's a phrase that's repeated many times in the book, every man does that which is right in their own eyes, is at first glance sounds like, well, okay, that's maybe not a bad idea, but what we see in Judges is actually it's a disastrous idea. And the result of that is almost the cease of existence of an entity that anyone could think of as Israel, as a Jewish presence in the land. It basically, at the end of this time, as we'll just briefly comment on, it's the people are on the verge of assimilation into the surrounding people and very close to a non-existence as a distinguished group of people. And we see Jerusalem in the end of the story, and Judges itself is quite a careful structure, where it builds on this idea of every man does that which is right in their own eyes, and it has a epilogue at the end of the book, which is a couple of stories, which really summarize in graphic and horrible detail just how bad things had gotten. And every bad thing you could imagine with sodomy and rape and murder and civil war and slaughter of thousands of people. It's just an absolutely terrible situation. And the role that Jerusalem plays in that is it's what the story goes is this Jewish individual is trying to recover his concubine and refuses to go to Jerusalem because it's a Gentile city, ends up going past Jerusalem to a Jewish city, and then the wheels fall off in the story and all sorts of horrible stuff happens. So it really emphasizes how bad things had gotten. But still, the city itself is not center stage, but what is being set up is getting to the point of then introducing Jerusalem as along with an individual that is takes on very much the meaning and the theme of the story of the city itself. And that individual is David. Now, we'll just read from a couple of verses here, and then we'll take a look at this slide and talk about it a little bit. The book of 1 Chronicles 11. Now we have the city becoming a very important part of the storyline. And it coincides with the rise of this man, David. First Chronicles 11, and starting, reading a few verses 4 through 8. Then David and all Israel went to Jerusalem, or Jebus as it used to be called, where the Jebusites, the original inhabitants of the land, were living. The people of Jebus taunted David, saying, "You'll never get in here." But David captured the fortress of Zion, which is now called the city of David. David had said that his troops David had said to his troops, "Whoever is first to attack the Jebusites will become the commander of my army." And Joab, the son of David's sister, Zeruiah, was first to attack, so he became the commander of David's army. David made the fortress his home, and that is why it is called the City of David. He extended the city from the supporting terraces to the surrounding area, while Joab rebuilt the rest of Jerusalem. So there's a few interesting tidbits in that, which we won't focus on in great detail because we really want to stick to the theme of the city. But careful reading of that section shows that there's more than just coming up to the walls of the city and taking it, and that's the end of the matter. We have the introduction of this man Joab into the text, and there's quite a substantial part of the historical piece of the Old Testament, which the historical section of the Old Testament, which is focused on David. David is built up as a character, as a personality, to a great degree. We learn a lot about David. We really get to know this person quite intimately, and it's a fascinating character. And one of the things that is part of the David storyline is this conflict, this counterbalance of this character by the name of Joab. And Joab becomes the captain of the army. He's a very different character than David. You have David, a man after God's own heart. You have Joab, a man after Joab's heart. And David, what's good for the people, what the principles that God want him to live by, and that will direct his footsteps. And you have Joab being driven by what's important to Joab. So you have this conflict. And this conflict, again, if you carefully read those verses, actually impacts the city itself. This is an artist's rendition, though there's a fair bit of archaeological work in this area around outside the current walls of Jerusalem, which are only about 500 years old, which are starting to sketch out some of the details of this city. But David basically takes the upper city, the citadel, and that becomes his palace. And when in the story, it almost seems to become sort of the ancient version of Camelot, really a center of worship and a center for a king who changes all the rules and is so much more than just the life of a monarch. And then you have the rest of the city, which basically comes under the administration of Joab. And it's interesting because that sort of two faces of Jerusalem become really quite appropriate as the story of Jerusalem expands in the Bible. What we have on one side, the David, the Jesus of the Old Testament, the one who saved the nation on the verge of dissolving, nation broken into little tribes, a nation besieged on every side, a nation on the verge of being crushed by these Philistines who had inhabited the coastal areas. The poor attempt to establish a monarchy under King Saul, who was before David, a miserable failure, meeting a disaster, catastrophic military defeat. It's where can the people go? And then David, the man after God's own heart, brings a stability, brings a prosperity, and brings a concept of worship of their God to a level of maturity and sophistication that just simply hadn't existed before. And then you have this Joab character who is the administrator of the rest of the city here, probably appropriate sort of depicted as the lower city. So it's very, that storyline between David and Joab is fascinating, but it isn't the focus of where we're going to go here. But the question is, why now introduce Jerusalem into the center of the story of the Bible? Why now with David? What is so special about about David. Well, number one, we can't talk about this character David without at least reading a couple of verses of the promises to David in 2 Samuel chapter 7. Second Samuel chapter 7. Just reading a section of this, we won't go through the whole thing. Starting at verse 12. For when you die, this is God talking to David, and are buried with your ancestors, I will raise up one of your descendants, your own offspring, and I will make his kingdom strong. He is the one who will build a house, a temple for my name, and I will secure his royal throne forever. I will be his father, and he will be my son's, and he will be my son. Now, okay, so we'll follow that theme to the natural son of David, but just casually reading those verses and knowing a little bit about history, you know that there's something left unfulfilled about those couple of verses, those few brief phrases, even by the end of the life of Solomon, David's son. And there is some obvious pointing towards a son who would be much more than Solomon. Of course, that's the Lord Jesus. But back to this connection with David and Jerusalem. What is interesting is up until this point, we're just given cameo appearances by Jerusalem. We're not really told very clearly that this is going to become a very special location. We got to, even in these verses right here, we see it's kind of, well, you can conclude that these promises can only be fulfilled if there's a location where David establishes his throne, and well, he ends up establishing it in Jerusalem. But you know, why aren't we told clearly back in Genesis or somewhere that Jerusalem's a special place, and I've decided that that's going to be the case? Well, the reason is because one of the themes of David's life is understanding the type of character that David was, and the message to us that God wants us to be like that. Why is David so many times called a man after God's own heart? What's David told? Take this city. I want you to take Jerusalem, David, because that's my chosen city. But we're never told that. So can we conclude that God didn't know what city would be this special place? Well, it's very important that we understand how we're told by people like Paul the Apostle how to read the Bible. We shouldn't try to speculate and try to ask hypothetical questions that we don't know the answer to. Right? All we're told is David was a man after God's own heart. He saw this city, and he took it, and now it becomes center to the story. Now, if you take a look at David's life, what's the great introduction to David? Of course, the story of Goliath, right? So he is, David and Goliath now really becomes a symbol, and you hear it all the time. You have this seemingly impossible competition between this teenage kid and this mighty warrior. But David knew what had to happen. And actually, you read the storyline there were very righteous people, like Jonathan, who were standing on the sidelines, who seemed to be waiting for God to do something. But David was not that kind of person. He knew the principle that he should live by. He knew his God. He knew what his God wanted of him. So he grabbed hold of the opportunity that presented itself, whatever it was, knowing that if he did the right thing, God would take care of the details. So it's a very similar theme to Jerusalem. David was a man who was not bashful about just doing it. And we did it with the right intent, driven by the right principles. God was going to make it work. And that type of faith was an actionable faith that really is meant to be an inspiration to us. So the fact that you take a look back at the story, you can go, looks like God really had this in the plan all along, and it seems now in kind of 2020 that it's quite logical that we end up at this location. But really the way we're supposed to read the story of David and the introduction of Jerusalem is this is a man who had the principles right. He was going to do it. He was going to act. Wasn't going to sit on his couch and wait for God to act. And the pieces would fall into place. It's even more fascinating when you compare this individual with the monarch before him, Saul, who every time he tried to do something, it seemed like he was off into the weeds. And pieces just never fell together for Saul. But with David, they always do fall together. And they fall right into the city of Jerusalem. Was it in God's plan all along? It does appear that's the case. But the important part is that it's introduced to us in a grand way by this man, David, a man after God's own heart, a man who took the principles and acted on it in a very decisive way, and then things just bloomed. What's fascinating about David is the importance of cities in David's life and in the David theme are quite small. David was a people builder. He wasn't a city builder. By the end of his reign, the nation had been transformed. Not necessarily so much transformed with great cities and huge walls and busy ports, but it had been spiritually transformed. The people had been brought together, true worship had been established, and everything was now different in all a very good way. The land had bloomed in a spiritual way, just as much as it ever had bloomed in a physical way under his reign. And now, kind of the center of that blossom, inspired by a man of action, the man after God's own heart, we now have Jerusalem. So let's now go to another historical section, 2 Chronicles. And we're now left in no uncertain terms the importance of this location to the storyline. 2 Chronicles chapter 2 and verse 5. Now this is during the reign of Solomon, David's son. And we have the establishment of worship at the newly constructed temple that now really comes to dominate this upper city area, and it can still be identified today. In 2 Chronicles chapter 2 and verse 5, the priests and the Levites brought up the ark along with the special tent and all the sacred items that were with it. Oops, sorry. 2 verse 5. Solomon speaking, "This must be a magnificent temple because our God is greater than all other gods. Who can really build him a worthy home?" So we have the temple now established. It's officially opened by Solomon, by King Solomon at this time. And then we go to a chapter later, 2 Chronicles chapter 6. Again, Solomon still speaking. "Praise the Lord, the God of Israel, who has kept the promise he made to my father David, for he told my father, from the day I brought my people out of the land of Egypt, I have ever chosen a city among any of the tribes of Israel as a place where a temple should be built to honor my name, nor have I chosen a king to lead my people. But now I have chosen Jerusalem as a place for my name to be honored, and I have chosen David to be king over my people Israel." So there's no doubt at this point of the importance of Jerusalem as now a physical and a very impressive location in the land with this huge temple. Now, we won't take a look at some of the cross references, but if you're taking notes, this is a very important fulfillment of a promise that had gone back many, many centuries. Deuteronomy chapter 2 and verse 5. God said that he would one day establish a place of worship in the land, and this now is the fulfillment of that. And there's many other passages which we, throughout the historical books, Kings, Chronicles, that refer to the fulfillment of this promise. Now, here we are then, seeming that the end of the story, or is it the end of the story? So we have Solomon, the son of David, a fulfillment of the promise to David, but is it the final fulfillment? Well, we see that there's problems with Solomon. He is very much a flawed character, and this manifestation of the promise, we realize now, is one initial manifestation, but that there must be something to look to in the future. And the reason that is because Solomon reigns mostly. It's a good reign, but really the nation starts to fall on difficult times even before his death. And then we have this period of the kings, which is another lengthy and interesting and a bit complicated section of history of the Jewish nation. It breaks into two kingdoms, a north and a south kingdom, and there's civil war between those two. There's all sorts of problems in the northern kingdom. The southern kingdom, which still has its capital as Jerusalem, has its ups and downs. They have kings who have it together, times of prosperity, and they have times of great trial and struggle, invasion, siege, and it's very much a time of up and down. Now this is an artist's rendition of the city as it could have looked, be very close to as it would have looked, because there are parts of the wall during this later period of the kings that have been found and traced back to this time period. But what happens is the decades go by, the centuries go by, Jerusalem continues to grow, continues to be an important center of worship, is the capital of the southern kingdom of Judah, that during this long period of the kings is really the dominant of the two nations. The more wealthy, the more stable, the one that holds together some semblance of a proper worship around the temple to the God of the patriarchs. But the general trend is not a positive one. So if we go to, let's go to 2 Kings 21. Now flipping over many decades in the historical text. Second Kings 21 and verse 7, we're introduced to this individual named Manasseh, King Manasseh. Now, just reference verse 7 and 8 here. I'll just read those two verses. Manasseh made a carved image of Ashtoreth and set it up in the temple, the very place where the Lord had told David and his son Solomon, "My name will be honored forever in this temple and in Jerusalem, the city I have chosen from among all the tribes of Israel." So that obviously does not bode well for the spiritual state of the people. Reading verse 8 now. If, and this is what God had said, if the Israelites will be careful to obey my commands, all the laws my servant Moses gave them, I will not send them into exile from this land that I have given their ancestors. But we can see from the actions of this King Manasseh, so sadly, the son of an inspirational character, King Hezekiah, who saw the near destruction of Jerusalem at the hands of the mighty Assyrian army. And though really all the lands between present-day Iraq and Egypt were taken by the Assyrian army, Jerusalem holds out. And could this maybe be now the time in which there will be a more true and complete fulfillment of these promises that were made to David? And how tragic that King Manasseh then takes the throne and has a long 50-plus year reign. And really, we end up then in verses 12 and 13. Let's just continue on in this chapter. Verse 14 of 2 Kings 21. Then I will reject even the remnant of my own people who are left, and I will hand them over to a plunder for their enemies. They have done great evil in my sight and have angered me ever since their ancestors came out of Egypt. Now, if we go to Jeremiah, which was a prophet prophesying at this time, we have a reinforcement of this condemnation. Read verses 1 through 3 and verse 8, just picking some parts out of the section here. The Lord gave another message to Jeremiah. He said, "Remind the people of Jerusalem about the terms of my covenant with them. Say to them, this is what the Lord, the God of Israel, says. Cursed is anyone who does not obey the terms of my covenant. But your ancestors did not listen or even pay attention. Instead, they stubbornly followed their evil desires. And because they refused to obey, I brought upon them all the curses described in this covenant." Now, there's a couple of important points here. That Jerusalem, through the text, takes on the meaning of more than just a physical place, more than just a city. It is tied with the Jewish nation. It becomes really synonymous, an allegory of the Jewish people themselves. Now, another important point is the curses referred to in this section here. Now, we won't go into it in detail because it's a lengthy passage, but this refers back to the list of curses that God lays out will happen to the people if they don't obey Him. Deuteronomy 28, verses 15 through 68, or 53 verses of curses. So that's why we're not going to go back and read it. But it's safe to say things are not going to go well if the people don't keep to their promise to God. God had kept His promise to them, but at the end of the day, they never keep their promise to Him. And as goes the nation, so goes Jerusalem. And this connection between the Jewish nation and Jerusalem is a very important and really a dominant aspect of the Jerusalem theme, ongoing, and to this very day. So now we are to the time of Christ. It just, again, describing the city in a little bit of detail. We've now jumped ahead in time from Manasseh. Basically, David is approximately 1000 BC. The time of Manasseh is approximately 600 BC, so hundreds of years of the rule of the kings, a slow decline. Eventually, the city is taken. The city is destroyed. The remnants are brought into captivity in Babylon, and then the city is rebuilt by Nehemiah, a governor during the time of the Persian Empire, And that brings us to the end of the storyline of the Old Testament. And there's about 400 years of silence before we start off again in the New Testament at the time of Jesus. And then this is the state of the city at that time. There's a reasonable amount known about the configuration of the city. It's now even a little bit larger. The walls have extended. There's kind of a 3D concept of it over to the left, and then this is more of a simple schematic. We have this temple area that is built on the same foundation that Solomon's temple was built on. We have the Roman fortress that plays a role in the story of the New Testament, the account of the Acts, the different details that were given around the temple and the preaching activities that were going on at that time. It was a well-defended city. It was a city that was invested in heavily by King Herod, who was the Roman magistrate at the time over this Roman province. And it is a reasonably prosperous center of trade and commerce in what was generally a poor part of the a poor backwater of the Roman Empire, the province of Judea during the time of Jesus. Now, Jesus would have known the city rather well. He would. There's other parts of the land that he spent more time in. Jerusalem was not a particularly hospitable location for his preaching. It was the center of their Jewish religious establishment, and was a place where Jesus was even in threat of his own safety, and we read about that in different passages in the Gospels. Now, the way Jerusalem sat in the storyline can't be much better summed up during the time of Jesus as it is here in Matthew 23. In the words of Jesus and the frustration he expresses over the state of the people. Again, Jerusalem equals the state of the people at that time. So it isn't, "Oh, people of Jerusalem," it's, "Oh, Jerusalem, Jerusalem, the city that kills the prophets and stones God's messengers. How often I have wanted to gather your children together as a hen protects her chicks beneath her wings. But you wouldn't let me. And now, look, your house is abandoned and desolate. For I tell you this, you will never see me again till you say, Blessed is the one who comes in the name of the Lord." Sorry, guys, I'm sorry. Blessings on the one who comes in the name of the Lord. So you can see how much the story ends in a tragic way. When Jesus utters those words, Jerusalem is not, at that time, a desolate city. But Jesus sees the soon destruction of the city, and again, Jerusalem as an allegory for the spiritual state of the people. It is fitting that it would end only a generation later, AD 70, under the foot of the Roman legions, completely destroyed. And really activity around the temple, really any meaningful center of worship at that time was lost. The city was completely sacked. So it's interesting to see the progression over the centuries and to see the storyline expand. So it is tied to the great type of Jesus, David. It is really linked at that time with such a wonderful person to the nation. But then, as the nation goes, so then goes the city. The people go off and find their destruction due to their choice, their behavior, their decision to reject their God, and the city, now a symbol of those people, is destroyed along with it. Now that brings us to the current state. And how symbolic that the center of Jewish worship now is a crumbling foundation of the original temple precinct built by Solomon. And I've been to Jerusalem, and it's not any more impressive in real life. You'd think they'd at least have pulled the weeds out, but it is a crumbling, weed-filled foundation. And so fitting of the plight of the Jewish people. They have not had a great couple of millennia. It's been a struggle. They have suffered persecution. Of course, we're all familiar with, in recent decades, the abstract brutality of the Nazis and their extreme level of anti-Semitism. But it's been a rocky road for the people now for many, many centuries. And as the city now sits divided, again, I've been to Jerusalem. Could you call it a beautiful city? It's an interesting place. It's a mix of old and new. It's divided, very much a divided city. It's a city that really is a compilation of centuries of history, of war, of tumult, and now, even today, when you're in Jerusalem and see this mix of old and new and the bit of a mishmash as it is, though I don't really want to take away, it is a pretty magical place. It's a pretty special place when you walk around. You can feel it does feel like there's a lot of history in that place. But even on the outskirts of the city, you have this huge security barrier that separates the West Bank from the city. Right above this location, you have the Temple Mount. On top of this foundation area that the temple was built is now a Muslim shrine sitting smack on in the center of it. And it is very much a place that it does not represent all the aspirations that were laid out for it so many centuries ago. It very much is fitting as now the capital of the Jews, with all the ups and downs and trauma that they've suffered, the divisions, the intractable situation that they now deal with two people claiming the same land. It's a very fitting city, and this is a very fitting shrine for those many centuries of struggle and torment. So just a couple of other slides. This is an artist's rendition of medieval period. So the city has not had many decades of peace and stability. It's always something going on, and many times it's been bad, center of conflict or war or power struggle. Through the period of the Crusades, many centuries of the medieval period, it was a contested city, fought bloody battles fought in and around it. At the end of the day, it was held by Muslim powers. And this is a diagram of a city that would be most similar to what we would see if you walked around it. It's now a metropolitan spread of buildings, but you can still walk around the 16th century walls that were built during the Byzantine period, another period of Muslim rule. And there's quite a few archaeological digs down in this area, which is outside the current walls, which is understood to be, they call it the city of David, but keep in mind that if you actually carefully look at the text that we did back in the Old Testament, this is Jerusalem and then the city of David as two separate entities, but quite a small area by our standards. It's even that the old city itself today is not that big, and the original area of Old Jerusalem is actually quite small by what we would think, is sprawling metropolitan areas and things like that. The city Jerusalem in its entirety, the metropolitan area is now spread over quite a large area, but most of it looks like the condo complex in Palm Springs more than it does the ancient city of Jerusalem that we read about in the Old Testament. Now, one thing that's important to see in the scriptures, though, is not, we're given the storyline. We're told in no uncertain details, in many places, what would happen to the city if the people made bad choices. They did, and the city that now becomes a symbol of the plight of the Jews now follows that same troubled path. But there's many verses which promise of a future time to come when the plights and the torment, the intractable problems that the people and the city find themselves in will finally be gone. And there's some beautiful visions given in Old Testament prophets and in a book like Revelation in the New Testament that paint a symbolic picture, but also a beautiful vision of a time to come where there would finally be peace in this special place. And today it's so far from that. This is reading from Isaiah 4 verse 2, which is a great example, certainly not the only one. But in that day, the branch of the Lord will be beautiful and glorious. The fruit of the land will be the pride and glory of all who survive in Israel. All who remain in Zion will be a holy people. Those who survive the destruction of Jerusalem and are recorded among the living. The Lord will wash the filth from beautiful Zion and cleanse Jerusalem from its bloodstain with the hot breath of fiery judgment. Then the Lord will provide shade for Mount Zion and all who assemble there. He will provide a canopy of cloud during the day and a smoke of flaming fire at night, covering the glorious land. It will be a shelter from daytime heat and a hiding place from storms and rain. And this passage is in no way unique. We are told wonderful, very clear, beautiful language of a future time of peace. And what's amazing is these verses were written at a time in which the city wasn't necessarily traumatized the way it is now. But the divine hand of God directed these prophets to write about a future time, knowing that it would see the great disasters that now we have witnessed in history. Another one from Jeremiah 3, verse 17. In that day Jerusalem will be known as the throne of the Lord. All nations will be there to honor the Lord. They will no longer stubbornly follow their own evil desires. And again, it's looking to, obviously, a future time. Again, during the time of Jeremiah, there was a nation of Israel. There was a king sitting on the throne. But Jeremiah looked to a future time in which that would go away and there would be a different manifestation that did not exist during that time, was different than this human king who made so many mistakes and ran the people and the city into the ditch. So I'll just leave that with you when it comes to researching Jerusalem in the scriptures. There just simply is no doubt about what the vision is in the Bible. It is consistent through prophets over numerous chapters, authors, and periods of time of when these books were written, that the city would see great struggle, as we have seen it. It would be destroyed. It would follow the path of the people that lived in it and suffer all the travails, but there would be a future time where there would be peace and stability. And we hope that that day comes soon, because we certainly don't see the land in that condition now. All right. Thank you.